This week, we're bringing the budget build to life. This week, I wanted to get the truck running. Kind of looking at how Matt and I have things scheduled, I was planning things out, trying to make sure that I could have this ready for a running video on the first week that we have it scheduled. And with how I had things planned and what I really wanted to accomplish, that was going to be difficult if I didn't start to get some things done soon in the actual electronics department. But as you know, we didn't have a whole lot of budget left over last week, and I needed to get it done with adding only $50 additional. So this week, I'm actually going to install a Hobbywing 1080 brushed crawler ESC and a stock 21 turn Titan Traxxas motor. Now, in all of the past budget builds, I got away with using stock electronics because they were ready to run vehicles. In this one, I didn't have that luxury, and it made things a little bit difficult, but I decided to just go budget minded as I could and try and just get a really basic ESC in there. The 1080 ESC from Hobbywing is a basic ESC. It's a little bit better than the 1060. It's got a better BEC, and hopefully it's enough to push that servo that we have in here from Traxxas. I told Matt my plan on this earlier in the week, and I'm pretty sure that he followed along as he kind of saw where I was headed. Now again, I chose the 1080 because it's a little bit better than the lower end ESCs that they offer, and it comes with a free programming card that allows us to play around with the settings a little bit. Generally, I would have of course loved to have thrown in a censored brushless system like I normally would, but this is the budget build and rules apply that we make up ourselves, so I guess I better follow them. Now in this video, I'm going to go through the installation process of the ESC and the motor, as well as all of the settings that I'm going to change in that 1080. It's got a number of different parameters with a bunch of different options, and I'm going to kind of dial it in to where I like best. Of course, my settings may differ from what you prefer just because I like to drive in a different way than a lot of other people drive, and that's the nice thing about having a programmable ESC. Now also, while I'm installing that motor and ESC, I'm going to be installing the receiver for my Futaba 4PV radio. Now I'm going to be using a Futaba 2106GF receiver for this 4PV. That's a inexpensive air receiver that Futaba makes, but it actually works really well with the ground-based FHSS systems like this one here. So the Traxxas motor comes with wires pre-soldered on, but it comes with bullet plugs on there, and I'd rather not have just these connections in general, and I don't want to splice in the middle of my wires, so I'm going to desolder the wires that come with the Traxxas motor, and I'm going to solder direct on the new wires that come with the 1080 ESC. Now this is a reverse rotation motor, just like would come in a TRX-4 Sport RTR again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to desolder the wires, and I'm going to solder the new ones on from the ESC in the same order. Again, I picked this motor because it was very inexpensive and just an easy route to go. Tons of other options for very similar motors. This is just one that I picked up just to try and get the budget build running on the cheap. My soldering iron's heated up. I'm going to reheat the solder tabs so I can remove the wires. Before attaching the wires from the ESC, I'm going to re-tin the solder tabs, which just means to add a little bit of fresh solder on there just to make sure I've got something to bond to. The wires that came with the 1080 here look to have like a small amount of solder on them, but not so much that you can even really see it, but you can't really unfray it. So what I'm going to do is cut the wires back a little bit, strip a little bit of the wire, and then re-solder that. This way I know exactly what kind of soldering I'm dealing with. After clipping it back, removing a little bit of insulation, I'm just twisting the bare wire strands together. Then I'm going to use my super worn out helping hands jig to hold the wire while I tin the end. So now I'm going to match up the lead that shows motor to positive to the solder tab that has got the little red mark here next to it. Since I tinned both ends of the wire, I can just heat both up at the same time by putting the soldering iron between them. Wait till it gets back to that flowing state, and then just remove the soldering iron while pushing the wire and the tab together. So now we have our motor attached to the ESC. Some people may like to have those bullet connectors between. To me, it's not that big of a deal. As of lately, all I've been running is XT60 type plugs, and luckily that's what this ESC comes with. However, for this build, I'm going to be running Traxxas batteries, which use Traxxas plugs. So I've got to change this plug out. So that's why I have this bag of Traxxas connectors. We're going to change this thing out. I'm not going to add these to the budget because generally I wouldn't have done this. If you've never wired a Traxxas connector, they use these little tabs, and on one side of it, it's engraved wire side. So that's where you actually put the wire, of course, and there's a little line to make sure that you keep your soldering from that point back. It's an easy, helpful guide, and it actually makes this pretty painless. So I'm going to take one of these tabs at a time and clamp them into my wiring jig here. Then we're going to add a little bit of solder to the tab. I do need to remove this plug. Rather than desoldering, I'm just going to snip it and rewire. After you solder this wire to the tab and slide it into this Traxxas connector, it's actually pretty well covered, and you don't normally have to use heat shrink. However, I'm still going to add a small amount just to make sure I'm extra cautious. So I'm going to take this length of heat shrink that came with the 1080 ESC, cut it in half, and put it onto each of the wires before I insert it. Again, with solder on both the tab and the wire, you can easily heat both sides up at once. Hold them together as everything cools, and you'll have a nice strong connection. So now we have both the wires soldered to the tabs, and we can insert it into the Traxxas connector. It's very clearly marked with a positive and negative, and red is positive, black is negative. Pretty hard to screw these connectors up. You can pretty easily insert the tab into the connector and get it most of the way in by hand. From there, I'm going to take my needle nose and just press it the rest of the way in. And now we have the plug installed on the end. I'm going to move the heat shrink all the way up to the plug itself, putting it all the way over the wire, and then I'm going to heat that heat shrink up and just lock it in place. So now with our ESC wired up, I've plugged in a Traxxas battery. This is a 1400 milliamp 3S pack. So the ESC is powered up here. Now currently we've got this lead coming off of here, which would normally go to your receiver. In the box there's going to be an additional lead, and this one we're actually going to need to be able to use this Hobbywing programming card that comes included with the 1080 for crawlers. So what we're going to do is take this spare lead here and plug it into this top port on the ESC. So now this plug that we just installed, we're going to put that into the back side of this programming card in the side that has the positive, the negative, and the signal symbol on the back. There's another one that just has positive and negative, and that's the one that we're actually going to use that is permanently attached to the ESC. With the ESC off and everything connected to the programming card, we can now turn the ESC back on. And now our programming card shows item 1 and value 3. You will want to have the manual handy for this part. This does show the default positions in a darker shaded color, but we're going to kind of go through and just see if there's anything that we want to change. Item 1 is the type of running mode, meaning the type of running that it does, like pull the trigger, go forward, hit reverse, and it actually either goes into reverse or it goes into brake. We want forward and reverse, no brake, and that is option 3, which is the default here. So then we're going to go to item 2. This is the battery type for either LiPo or nickel metal batteries. I'm running LiPo, so value 1 is what I want to have. Item 3 refers to the type of cutoff. Now this depends on what type of batteries you're running. If you're running a LiPo battery, like a normal quality LiPo battery, the default setting of 3 is good and fairly safe for most LiPo batteries. Item 4 is the start force. So at a default, this is at 4%, meaning that when you pull a trigger, the very lowest amount of power that the ESC will send is 4% of the battery's voltage. That just means that the 0 to 3% range is completely removed, so you do possibly lose a little bit of resolution at the bottom. I'm going to put mine down to option 1 on this just because I want all of the resolution my radio has to give. Item 5 is the max forward force, meaning just how much throttle you actually have. The default is 100%, and I absolutely want 100% of the capability. Item 6 is the same thing, but for reverse. The factory setting on this is 50%. I want 100%, so I'm going to change value of 2 to a value of 4. Item 7 is brake strength, and since we're in a crawler mode and we have forward to immediate reverse, this item really doesn't matter to us at all. Item 8 is initial brake strength, and again, doesn't apply to us in this situation. Item 9 is drag brake. Now the default in this is 100%, and personally, I normally don't like 100% drag brake, but with, cheap sealed can motors like this, it doesn't really give you all of the power or drag that I'm used to having. So I'll probably want more drag brake than normal, but normally I only run about a 30% drag brake on a brushless system. I'm going to choose to kind of go somewhere in the middle between that 30% that I normally do and 100%. 50-60% range. I'm gonna go with a value of 60% for this, so that's gonna be option 5. The next option is drag brake rate, and this is basically how fast it gets on the brakes once you release the trigger. If you put it all the way to the hardest level, basically as soon as you let off the throttle, it's going to apply that drag brake as fast as possible. This is kind of a cool option. I'm gonna leave it in the middle here at a 4 out of 9. We'll see how that feels. 11 is neutral range. This is basically the amount of slop it has in that neutral area for different radios. Some radios will require a larger range because they may not center as well in that. I'm gonna leave this at a default. And I think most of you will be fine doing that as well. Item 12 is start mode, and this is basically how fast it puts on the amount of power that you give it. For me, I want to modulate this myself, so I'm going to take this from the default range of 5 and I'm going to crank this up to 9. That way I decide how fast I put on the power. I prefer that. Item 13 is PWM frequency, which is pulse width modulation frequency. We're going to leave this as a default for now. Item 14 is BEC voltage. This is either 6 volts or 7.4. This just depends on your servo. My servo is capable of taking 7.4 volts, so we're going to change it from the default of 6 to value 2, which will make it 7.4. Item 15 on this is called freewheeling. Now, by default, it's disabled, but it says for crawlers, we suggest enabling it. With it enabled, your crawler can have better linearity during a low speed running and also less heat. This one, I personally do not know what it is, but we're gonna try it. We're gonna enable it like they suggest, so we're gonna change the default from 2 to 1, and we're gonna see what this is like. I honestly have not played with this function on a Hobbywing ESC, so we're gonna go with what they suggest. We'll see if I like it. We're gonna use our 2mm driver to remove the screws holding on the motor plate cover so that I can get that motor plate out and then install the motor onto it. After removing the 3 screws, the motor plate stayed attached to the cover. We need to remove just that motor plate for now. The Traxxas motor plates use a preset pinion mesh design, so we need to look up what position we need to mount our motor in the Traxxas manual. I'm going to be using the included 17 tooth pinion that came with the Traxxas kit to install to this. When installing this set screw, make sure to use a small amount of Loctite. So now we have our pinion installed on there. Make sure that you do this with the motor plate already on because this one doesn't fit through the motor plate. After checking the manual using the 17 tooth pinion that I've got here and the 39 tooth spur that's in the vehicle, we're going to use location C, and we're going to attach the motor to the motor plate with the M3x8 screws that were included with the assembly kit. When installing the motor onto the motor plate, make sure that you look at the orientation of your wires. I wanted to make sure that my wires were sticking upwards so that they were easy to route in the chassis. We're going to route the motor wires through the guide that's attached to the chassis rails, and then we're going to reinstall the spur gear cover. So with this setup, of course, we can't adjust the gear mesh, but I'm going to roll the vehicle back and forth just to make sure everything sounds appropriate. Sounds pretty good. I'm going to add a little double-sided tape to the back side of our 1080 and stick it to our slider. So now what we have left to do is run the receiver wire over to the waterproof receiver box. Normally you would want to do this when you're assembling the kit the first time, but since I didn't do that, what we need to do is I need to remove the screws holding this battery tray in because I want to route it right underneath of there as directly as possible to this receiver box because this wire is not very long. I'm going to use the little loop that they have molded into the transmission case to hold the receiver wire, just like you'll see in the factory TRX-4s. So now I'm going to replace the 2 screws I removed from the battery tray. Now before putting the receiver lid and everything back on, if you're putting in a new receiver, make sure to bind it to your radio. I've buttoned everything up before and then realized I forgot to bind my receiver and had to redo everything again. So I've made a new model in my radio. Now I'm going to bind the receiver. Got the battery plugged in, powered on the ESC. Now for a Futaba, all I do is press and hold the little bind button on the receiver. If you've got a Spectrum or something different, it may be a different process. So now everything's bound up. We can button this setup back up and then we can do our final setup on the ESC and steering. Now, this next step is a step that a lot of people leave out when installing a new ESC, but it's very important to do. Now, if you don't do this, you could be either losing out on output of the ESC itself. Your radio may think you're giving it full throttle, but the ESC may only see 90%. So you want to make sure that you calibrate it so that the ESC thinks 100% is the same thing as what your radio thinks. Now, to program the throttle positions, I am using a Futaba radio. There is some differences sometimes with Futaba radios. Sometimes ESCs see Futaba radios full throttle as full reverse. So in this case, if you're using a Futaba radio, when it says you need to pull full throttle, you may need to use full reverse and vice versa. So this time, we're going to press and hold set, turn the ESC on, release the set button right away as it's beeping. In the neutral position now, hit set. Then for a Futaba, we're gonna need to go full reverse and hit set again. Then full forward and hit set. Release everything and let it confirm. And now we're good. Now, as I pull forward, it goes in reverse and vice versa. So what we need to do is we need to go into the radio menu and reverse that channel. So now we have everything installed and operational. I'm gonna just take it outside and do just a quick little run around. We'll do a couple curb crawling things just to see how the settings are, if I can feel the drag brake that I like, if everything is acting, reasonably how I want. And I'm gonna use it as a quick excuse to go test my new DJI Osmo Action Cam. This will be the very first thing that I'm filming with it, and I'm kind of excited to see how it works. I'm actually really happy with my super scientific parking lot testing. And I'm also enjoying this new camera. So, I'm actually really happy with how that thing worked out. It's smooth and it's got enough power that I'm not unhappy driving it. Oftentimes I find that, brush systems to me just don't have enough there to really do the things that I want to do, but the Traxxas brush motors are a little bit larger can than normal and have decent power and decent speed, so I think that it'll be good enough to hold me over until I can really put what I want in way down the road, and possibly even after the budget build is over. But for now, I'm plenty happy running what we've got installed here. I would have liked to have done some more DIY stuff this week, but I'm gonna hold it for next week, as next week is a mandatory DIY week for the budget build. So next week, Matt and I will both be showing you something you can do with, little to no cash added. I'm definitely gonna have to do some thinking as to what I really want to do for next week. I'll make sure and ask Matt what he's going to do, so maybe I can steal his idea for next week. But it does make for a good question for this week, and that is, what should I do for a DIY? We already did the super common bumper mod to give us better approach and departure, and of course get rid of the bumper on bumper look that the body has out of the box. So I'm either gonna have to get to thinking and come up with a good plan, or maybe some of you guys have a good idea of things I could tackle. I think that we are going to allow 3D printing in the DIY week, and I know not everybody has 3D printers, and we're gonna kind of address that later as well. But anything that I do make during the DIY week with the 3D printer, I will post the file for free so that some of you guys who might have a 3D printer as well can make whatever I make, if that's the route that I choose to go. But let's do a quick rehash of the budget so far. Last week we were left over with a little bit of cash, and we're gonna add that to the $50 for this week that we have. I found Hobbywing 1080 ESCs available for $35. Now, one thing to note is that we've never included shipping in the budget builds. And $35 is the cheapest that I found for the Hobbywing, although it had a little bit higher shipping than normal, so average might be a little bit more expensive, but even if so, still had the money in the budget. So $35 for the Hobbywing ESC, and a little under $22 for the motor. Puts us at about $56.35 for the week. And with my roughly $10 left over from last week, that still puts me under budget, because not only can I do math, but I stick to the rules. But in the end, it's all just for fun anyways. But as always, guys, I appreciate all of you for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe if you're not already. Hit the notification bell so you see the videos as soon as they get uploaded. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next Wednesday for the next episode of The Budget Build. Thanks for watching again, and we'll see you on the next one.